All right, welcome back, everybody, to our second reading roundtable discussion. For those of you that are just joining us, we are a group of teacher candidates from Pacific University, a small university outside of Portland. As part of our academic interventions class, we are doing this video because we've all read books on dyslexia, and we're here to discuss them. Before we get started, we should all kind of introduce ourselves and the books that we read, so I will get started with that. My name is Tony Sinclair, and I've worked as a school counselor at both the primary and secondary levels. I've also worked as a special education teacher in middle school last year. I've had a foster son with an intellectual disability and worked privately with a number of families with kids with varying disabilities. The book I read was Teaching Students with Dyslexia, Dysgraphia, Oral Written Language Learning Disability, and Dyscalculia, Lessons from Science and Teaching by Berninger and Wolf. The book was organized into sections that kind of discussed different research very briefly and then gave some related teaching tips, some assessment tools, and some resources that you could go and locate for yourself in order to teach. I thought that it was a pretty good book as a good starting point if you wanted to start learning about what kind of assessments or what kind of strategies you could use, but it didn't really offer a lot in the way of specific strategies that I could use in the classroom. Avery read the same book, so why don't we let her go ahead and introduce herself.
Right. Hi, my name is Avery Kramer. I'm a member of the SPED 2018 cohort. I worked as an instructional assistant in a kindergarten through second grade communications class, and that was a class that focused on students with communication disorders. Prior to that, I worked as a life enrichment specialist in a group home, and 3 of the clients that I served had communication needs. As Tony said, I also read Teaching Students with Dyslexia, Dysgraphia, OWL, LD, and Dyscalculia by Berninger and Wolf. I thought this would be a good read for people who work with kids of all ages, and especially those with learning disabilities. Since the book also covers dyscalculia, I recommend it for people who do more like gen ed and go across different subjects. And I think it had some pretty good instructional tips in there.
All right. What'd you read, Heidi?
I read a book called Essentials of Assessing, Preventing, and Overcoming Reading Difficulties by David Kilpatrick. It had a lot to do with assessments and tests to figure out if there was a finding on how to cure the dyslexia. It seemed, though, as if there was a lot of tests, but there really is no good answer for it. This would be a great book if you want to get a more in-depth look at assessments and interventions to helping students with dyslexia.
Awesome. And what was your background in education?
Oh, yes. I worked as an instructional assistant. I've worked at many different areas. I've worked at the Juvenile Detention Center working with the kids that are on probation. I've worked with, I worked in a preschool autistic program with preschool students, which they happen to be all boys because it seems that boys are higher risk or have a higher incidence of having, anyways, I also worked through first grade through 8th grade and up to high school with students with disabilities. My last job that I had, I worked with high school students who were on IEPs and had problems with completing their classes and then need extra assistance in helping them with their reading and math abilities.
Awesome, thank you. What about you, Megan?
My name is Megan McCarthy, and I read Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally Shaywitz. This book was really helpful for teachers and parents and students with dyslexia. I think it gives a good history on dyslexia and assessments and different ways to overcome the struggle of reading. It also gives helpful accommodations for a person that does have dyslexia. And my background is I am a special ed teacher in a behavior classroom. I teach kindergarten through 3rd grade in a public separate school.
Awesome. How about you, Stephen?
My name is Stephen Hutt. I'm currently also in the cohort for an endorsed special education endorsement. I currently hold a master's in social science education. The book I read was by Louisa Cook Moats. It's called Speech to Print, Language Essentials for Teachers. It's a beneficial book for any teacher that's going to have to teach reading, writing, or any of those types of tools to students. It really does give, the book does give a breakdown of speech down to the basic components, and then works its way up and then provides descriptions on how to effectively promote those tools for students to be able to navigate those components of language.
Awesome. And then Whitney, right?
Yes, I'm Whitney. The book I read was Unlocking Literacy by Marcia Henry. The book would be a great resource for making lesson plans or doing different kinds of assessments. It gives a lot of examples of activities and stuff. The book's broken into 2 sections. It's broken into preparation and instruction. So the preparation focuses on decoding and spelling, as well as the structure of English. And the instruction part focuses on all the different types of readers, so early instruction, beginning, advanced, and competent readers. One thing that I thought was valuable from this book was the importance of oral language with young children and their families, and the fact that the vocabulary that parents use and the sentences that parents use with their children really impacts the knowledge that they have going into the school setting.
Interesting.
Oh, and then my background also. Sorry. I worked in a behavior classroom for the past 2 years as an instructional assistant, and I've also worked with the juvenile department with kids on probation. So, yeah.
That's super cool. That's what I'd like to be doing one of these days, but I haven't found my way into that particular realm yet. So for interested parties, we'll go ahead and post some links down below the video to Amazon where you could purchase these books, and maybe a short description of kind of some of the things that we thought were important from the book, because through the discussions we've had already, it seems like having a collection of these resources is probably more valuable than having just one or the other of these resources. So before we get started, it seems like a good idea to kind of provide you with a basic definition of what dyslexia is. And broadly speaking, dyslexia is just a word that means the condition of having impaired lexicon or problems with words. When we're talking about it in education, we're generally talking about problems with reading, not just problems with like understanding words. We also discussed dysgraphia a little bit, which refers to impairment in letter production, so writing. And then a couple of us read a book that covered dyscalculia, which is an impairment in ability to perform calculations. But due to the fact that that's not what other people's books covered, we won't really discuss that very much in this video. Did anybody have anything to add to that definition or that description?
Yeah, my book gives a definition that children can understand the spoken word, but they cannot decipher the words when they are written in the written form. It also says that dyslexia affects 1 out of 5 children and 10 million in America.
Awesome. So one thing, and I forgot to mention it when I was doing my introduction, that I found pretty interesting from my book was just how interconnected the different parts of reading and writing and speech of the using language were. And it went into a little bit of detail about, you know, how research into the brain really supports the idea that there are these different types of learning disabilities, but it is really kind of hard to nail them down. Just by looking at brain imagery or by how people perform. So how important it is to kind of take a bunch of different angles at teaching this kind of stuff. Did anybody else's book have a lot of information or anything that you guys found interesting about how the brain affects learning or so forth?
Well, actually, I have a definition that my book gives, and my book says it's a condition in which an individual struggles with word reading despite adequate effort and instruction. It says there is no standard for precisely how weak the word reading skills need to be in order to be considered dyslexia. Not only that, dyslexia is a psychological and medical term and is not an instructional term. So that's something to consider, that it is more of a medical term, and that instructional when it comes to school and diagnosing people with disabilities, that it's not considered a disability to be considered as needing help in your education.
So that it's not
Yeah, to
an
go off
eligibility care category that we use in education.
What was that?
Oh, I said it sounds like what you're saying is that it's just not an eligibility category that we use in education.
Correct.
Okay.
And Heidi, to go off of what you were just saying, my book talks about how Dr. Rudolph Berlin talked about dyslexia as being a form of word blindness, and that it was a part of the aphasia family, so part of Broca's area and Wernicke's area in the brain.
Well, I have one more thing to add. It says in our culture, dyslexia has a mystic about it. It has many misconceptions, and it really refers to poor word leveling and reading and speculation about visual spatial perception deficits. It is inconsistent with any research findings, which makes it very hard to have a real good understanding of what it is.
All right. Anybody else have anything to add before we move on?
I'd like to add about Broca's area that Megan brought up a little bit. And so with the brain imaging that they mentioned in the Berninger and Wolf book, they noticed that there's differences in Broca's area, specifically the left portion, which affects phonological coding, and the right portion of Broca's area, which affects orthographic coding. And they also noticed that there's some differences in the scans pertaining to the right cerebellum, which would affect the timing of language. So there are a few brain scans that they've done that have shown that there is a brain patterning or brain difference than people without dyslexia.
Interesting. Yeah, I read that in the book as well, and I just couldn't remember exactly which brain area was doing what. So I was hoping that you could help me out there and bring that in for us. All right, so during class, one of the things we talked about are kind of the five, or what we call the 5 pillars of language. And we want to take a moment to kind of define and discuss each one of those things and kind of what we found out about each of those areas during our reading. So the 5 pillars that we discussed were phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And I think we're going to go through those in that order just because, as you'll see through the conversation, they tend to build on each other. Not like a one-to-one, you can't do this until you do this, but they're interrelated to quite some extent. So let's go ahead and start with phonemic awareness. Who can give us a good definition? Stephen can.
So phonemic awareness is just a aspect of a bigger part of phonological awareness. And so when we talk about phonemic awareness, we're actually talking about students' capacity when it comes to their overall process, which is the phonological awareness. And phonological awareness it refers to meta-linguistic facility of a person to be able to identify, think about, and apply mental manipulation to words. So that's what phonological awareness is. Now, phonemic awareness, when it's broken down a little bit further, is the ability to interchange the components of the word in order to make a comprehensive word going forward, or sentence structure. So that's the definition of at least what my book, or I drew from my book, what phonemic awareness is just part of a phonological awareness.
And I kind of got that it was about just understanding that speech is made up of specific sounds or phonemes, and how those pieces fit together in order to construct language, or like Stephen was saying, to construct words. So it's really about the actual sounds that are parts of our language, right?
Yeah, and the thing is that when you look at phonemes, the phonemes are not the letter sounds of, like, when you say this is a, eh. Okay, that's the phoneme. That's what students want to be able to do. They want to be able to see the symbol and make the sound. You don't want to have, like, when we go through the alphabet and we try to explain to students A, and that's the letter A. That's not what we want to try to do when it comes to phonetic soundings. We want to try to give the students the symbol to the sound. And then as they progress building new words, they have more understanding. And when that understanding starts to flourish, it tends to then start becoming the process of navigating language a little bit better.
Does anybody remember exactly how many phonemes there are in our language? Wasn't it like 40 something, 43, and we've only got like 26 letters, right? So I think that what Stephen was saying about not teaching that one-to-one correspondence can be pretty important, right? Did anybody have?
My book.
Go ahead.
My book, Unlocking Literacy, gave some activities for that, for both phonological awareness and phonemic awareness. And they included rhyming, syllable awareness, sound awareness, syllable deletion, sound deletion, syllable blending, syllable segmentation, sound blending, and sound segmentation. And they went through the book and gave different examples of how you could do that and what sounds you would work with and that sort of thing.
The other thing that, go ahead, Tony. The other thing that I just want to point out is that in this process of phonetics is that there's a term called the schwa, and this is as we progress farther down in our speech to print that it's a multisyllable word, and so what we do is we tend to attach certain connotations of vowels, and then parts of other words are dropped. And so like Whitney was saying, it's imperative that you do those drills because it's only part of one of the layers of our language that we have to navigate. And if we're not practicing the techniques in those specific language layers, then students are going to have a difficulty navigating print because they don't have an understanding of how it's supposed to sound.
I'd like to add to the phonemic awareness. In my book, it's a little bit more basic of a term, and it's the inability to develop a sight word vocabulary. And sight words have to do with fluency. So if you don't have a good sight word vocabulary, your fluency is not going to be very well. In phonemic awareness, if you're a reader, they have a good accuracy level, but the fluency is not as high as their accuracy.
Interesting.
And I think that also goes on with the idea of, again, skill development. When you look at having fluency, the more students are taught the skill, taught the specific type of instruction to look at a word, where does the word come from, how's the word, what influences the word, how does the word sound, how do those change depending on what other avenues or whatever things you lump onto the word. So it's like Heidi said, it's the ability through skill and repetition and all those components make it an easier time for students to be able to navigate all the aspects of print.
All right. Whitney, in your book, when they were giving you all those kinds of different strategies or whatever, did they give you an idea of like how long or what you would expect a student to practice those skills each day? Is that like a 5 or 10 minute thing, or is this like a big segment of the day you would practice those?
Yeah, they didn't really give a time limit. It was mostly just like sample like lessons and lesson ideas or even just activity ideas. It wasn't really a time frame.
Okay.
What was helpful in my book called this whole thing called Breaking the Code, so that we have the code of reading and how to break it, and it broke everything down that we've been talking about into different parts. And so the first part was the sound advice, and then that focuses on rhyme awareness, working on words, and then separating words into syllables. Then part 2 of the code would be putting all of that into writing, and that would be sight words and practice, writing and spelling. And this just built the students' confidence while learning. It doesn't give a specific timeline, but it does segment everything.
I see. So it sounds like, and this is to be expected, that we've started talking about phonics to a certain extent. Did you have something else you wanted to say before we moved into phonics, Heidi?
Nope.
Oh, okay. So did somebody have like a good definition of what phonics is then?
I'll say what I found out that phonics is. According to my book, it is a system for approaching reading that focuses on the relationships between letters and sounds. And phonics is important because it helps with sounding out unfamiliar words, which then in turn helps with reading.
The one thing that I want to share is that with Heidi, I'm going to piggyback on that, because what Heidi is, and at least in my book, what I'm correlating phonics to is that you look at it from its idea of morphology, and students are given a word. Students then have to decode the symbols in the word, but then match up the correct sounding of that letter symbol. And as they progress, students are going to need to be able to have linguistic background and understanding where those words originated from. As in the idea is like when it comes to English, students are asked to look at 3 different type of linguistic layers, and those are ranging in words, and those are also ranging in rule sets that you have to be able to navigate because they don't have the same general structure going forward. If students are encountering an Anglo-Saxon background linguistic, then they're going to have certain rules that they have to follow, while they're not going to be applicable to the Latin-based linguistic set of rules, as well as the Greek set of rules that are all thrown into our language.
Interesting. It seems like last time we were talking, somebody had a pyramid or something like that in their book that talked about what words were used for, and that had something to do with their origins. Who was that?
Yeah, that was more for the vocabulary aspect of it. But...
Oh, well, we'll save that for later.
Okay.
So, I mean, it sounds like, phonemic awareness is about the sounds from your language, and phonics is about connecting those sounds to the symbols that you use in your language or the alphabet, right?
Yeah, some of the goals that were shared, at least in my book, is that what you want students to try to do when it comes to phonetics is that you want to try to have students pronounce the words orally, because in certain languages, the way that you pronounce words can affect the meaning that you're trying to convey to others that you're speaking with. That may be native speakers with that particular part of the language. Also, you want to pay attention to how you sound out words, how you spell words, and also the meaning of the words. Make sure that it's very clear and concise in how you, from the start, to how you sound it, to how you write it, to how you portray it to students. Because if there's any type of miscommunication, as I think what happens with dyslexia when it comes to looking at print, like you said, if it's a brain-based issue, there's something that's going on when it comes to all those filters that's showing that students don't have a direct understanding of the word. And then also vary words, so students have a vocabulary that's interchangeable with each linguistic layer of English. If you're only giving students, a specific, layer, they're only going to know how to navigate those specific rules. But then if you throw in a different set of linguistic layer rules that they have never navigated before, it's going to be difficult to ask them to then start processing and remembering and then I call it regurgitating. I'm sorry, I knew I could use a better word for that, but regurgitating all those things that go along with those 2 other linguistic levels. So.
I see. All right. Did anybody have anything else to say about like phonics instruction or why it was important to the things that come after it? No? All right. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no, I think one last thing about phonics. Phonics instruction helps to make sure that students are able to navigate vocabulary effectively. If students understand what they're reading and how they sound it out, they're not going to struggle with the aspect of having to sound out k, at. They're not going to have that struggle. It's going to be automatic, like what Heidi was saying, because she's above me on the screen. Heidi was saying was that it then becomes an automatic. So students are not focusing so much on that idea of I have to put the word together. They're more focused on how does that word play out in the overall structure of what's being presented to me through written text or through oral presentations.
All right. So depending on the model we've looked at or how we've been discussing it in class, they've kind of gone back and forth on whether, vocabulary or fluency comes first on the hierarchy. What makes most sense for you guys to discuss first?
Well, I think that it comes down to, I'm sorry, just jump in anybody who feels like wanting to talk. When it comes to, I think you have to have the understanding of vocabulary before you can have the accuracy and fluency. If you don't have the mechanisms in understanding how to break down the word, and you don't understand how those sounds connect together, you can't be fluid in applying the word, whether that be understanding how it sounds and how you use it effectively in sentence structures, oral presentations, or go ahead, somebody else name something. I'm going to throw it out there. Somebody else jump on it.
Yeah,
I think it has to do with having a large sight vocabulary. That's what seems like my book went back to many times, is having a large sight vocabulary is a huge foundation to the whole reading aspect and understanding of words.
Excellent. What else did we have on vocabulary? Go ahead.
Yeah, so Unlocking Literacy describes vocabulary is a pyramid, and it has 3 layers, which is Anglo-Saxon at the bottom layer, Latin is the middle, and then Greek is the top. And they gave a definition of each. So Anglo-Saxon was mostly short, common, everyday, down-to-earth words used in ordinary situations. Latin was technical, sophisticated words used primarily in more formal contexts. And then Greek was mostly specialized words used mostly in science. So it definitely helped me, even just being able to see something that really laid out how and why you use certain words. And I think that'd be helpful to students as well. And I know that Stephen has more to say on that.
Well, and when you look at when it comes to linguistics and the layers that you have to go through is that, like Whitney was saying, students, when they're going to be at we use everyday Anglo-Saxon wordage and verbiage every day. And as you grow up through the levels of linguistics, you're asking students to write more and more and more and more. Well, if you don't have the understanding of you can use these parts of this word, but you can't use these, they don't apply to this word, it makes it difficult for students to understand vocabulary, but also make sure their fluency comes together. Because if they're struggling with, I know I'm not supposed to have this part of a Latin root word, but they don't know how to decode it, or they don't know how to effectively manage all the components in that word because they don't have sufficient skills in working with that linguistic layer, then their vocabulary is going to suffer from it. And their vocabulary suffers, then their fluency suffers. And then now you're spending more time as a teacher focusing on those aspects, trying to get those skill sets and instilled into the student. And then the thing is that, like I was sharing with Whitney has the pyramid, but there's stairs. And so you're getting these stairs of skill sets that you want to teach students in order to be able to navigate that pyramid effectively.
And I think when also looking at the pyramid, the higher, like the Latin and the Greek words are going to be more academic. And so if you can get those students up those stairs to that level, then they're going to be more successful in the future too.
And then also sitting there and sharing how to also navigate those academic languages and when you're going to be able to apply them though too is also beneficial in helping them get up those stairs. Because if they don't have, again, you can only give them the pyramid and then give them the stairs, but unless they have the skills to navigate it and understand, but the main point is to understand how the words are built is probably the most impactful part of how my book shares on how that whole process goes. The more students understand how their language is put together and they're able to practice those components of the language, then they're able to move forward in becoming successful at using and becoming masters of the language.
So, I mean, all these pyramid and stair analogies make it sound like to me that you would focus on the Anglo-Saxon roots and those kinds of words first. Is it kind of like the glue of the language? Is that our like ands and does and like the things that help us fit things together?
Well, the way that I've looked at it is like a pyramid.
Not even.
No, it's a question. That's what I'm asking.
Well, yeah, no, I think it's like morphemes are like it's basically you take 2 words and put them together. Example is tattletale. So it's easy in Anglo-Saxon linguistics to be able to just pull 2 words together to get a meaning. And because it's also based on German influences, I think we said this yesterday in our first recording, she brought up having very rooted Germanic influence. And so that is also a byproduct of linguistics that students are going to have to learn from this particular layer when they're navigating through English. But as you go through, like when you look at the Latin roots, there's a specific hierarchy structure, and it shows in our book a good pyramid of going down about what you can. For example, you have prefixes, roots, combining form, and suffixes. So those are like the first 4 of the pyramid, and then you go down even deeper in how you're going to, are they inflectional or are they derivative? So it's also learning how the language is also applied as you're also writing it. You also have to pay attention to how you're talking too when you're using the higher order thinkings, not just how you're going to write it, but also how does it sound when you say it? Because if you say certain Greek words, if you use that out of context, it just sounds funky. And so we don't want kids sounding funky because they don't understand which linguistic layer they're working with and which linguistic layer's rules they have to apply.
Interesting. I'll have to look at it. I think if I ask any more questions, I'm just going to confuse people.
Trust me, it was a hard read book too. It was very technical from front to back. It was like, I just need to stop. I have a.
All right. Anybody else have anything to say about vocab? No? All right. So, what was that? All right.
Oh, we're good. Sorry.
Good. What about fluency? What did you guys read about fluency?
My book talks about teaching fluency, and it gives 3 steps to teaching fluency. That you should first focus on the child's oral reading, and then have a time practice, and then just give the child ongoing feedback. That's what my book talked about.
Is that because it helps them learn better, or is it because it helps us assess better how well they're doing? Or is it both?
Probably a little bit of both, because I think the student needs that feedback, but it also, I think, would just help the teacher as well assess the student.
Yeah, some of the interventions that my book had for fluency included repeating reading both silently and orally, but they focused primarily on orally because they didn't think that for fluency enough oral reading, oral practice occurred for students, and that they really emphasized that that was really important so that the students could hear themselves read or hear others read so that they know what the words are supposed to sound like.
Excellent.
And that's one of the things that in my book sat there and talked about is that what Whitney's book was piggybacking what Whitney just said, which is that we need to teach our students how to use idioms, metaphors, and other figures of speech because it is different when you hear yourself talk using your speech than when you have to write it. And if you can't have that inflection, if you can't have those references with your voice on the paper, it's going to create a little bit of confusion and havoc. But it's also necessary because we're asking students to use different examples of writing that convey different meanings of messages while they're in the classroom. And so it's imperative that we understand that we have to teach that concept to our students to be able to ask them to even meet us halfway in creating written work samples.
Let's see.
In my book, I have a few things that it talked about with reading fluency, and the first one is called RAN. It's the rapid automation naming. It includes digits, letters, objects, or colors. It's actually a measure that tells you how quickly individuals can name objects aloud by their colors and letters. An example of that would be you have 5 small squares of different colors. They're presented in rows on a page, but the order changes. So the child must name the items in order. Well, it doesn't really matter if they understand the color and the size. It's more about fluency. They're not caring about the colors or the size. They're trying to see the fluency of the child. So that's one way, is the rapid automation. The second one is word level fluency, which has to do with real words and nonsense words. It refers to unfamiliar words that students encounter. They're functional words, but they're also considered nonsense words. Until they are correctly identified, they're considered nonsense words to the students. Another one I have is sentence level fluency, and that refers to how groups of sentences sound when read one after another. It's basically when someone reads you a sentence, is the sentence enjoyable to listen to? That's how you know if they have good sentence level fluency. The last one I have is passage level fluency. The only thing is I couldn't find any really good information in my book on what actually passage level fluency is. So I don't really have a good answer for you on that one. I don't know if anybody else read anything in their book about passage level fluency.
Not that I recall. That doesn't mean it's not there, though.
My book was really hard. It had a lot of research, but I felt like I could never find a really good answer to these questions.
So I'm going to jump in real quick to go back to Whitney's on types of fluency tasks, because Berninger and Wolf also listed the choral readings, which is reading out loud. But they mentioned other ways to help students improve fluency would be sentence completions, round robin repeated readings, reading theaters, choral readings, partnered readings, monitored readings, and repeated readings. And they really were careful to note that students need to practice choosing the correct option for a particular word with specific meanings, because all that hard work can be easily overwhelmed if the student is practicing mistakes over and over rather than the correct way of speaking.
Yeah.
Well, that also, go ahead, Tony.
I was gonna say, I don't remember what they called it, but I seem to remember them also talking about building sentences where you start with a simple sentence like, there's a green frog or something. And then they're like, oh, what did it do? And then they're like, oh, it hopped. And then why was it hopping and so forth? So they're building more and more complex sentences and seeing how the pieces fit together to build fluency.
Well, and that goes into the idea of like what we're all talking about is that we're all trying to teach kids multiple meanings of how words are used in language and how that works. And when that happens, at least in my book, it says that when students are taught with multiple meanings of words, then they have a deeper understanding and it broadens their vocabulary, and it may facilitate better word recognition and word retrieval, and then also comprehension. So all four of those elements, as long as we all are talking about, the more avenues for students to be able to use words, can, get feedback from those words, and vice versa. It's going to help them in all the aspects of the areas of their fluency.
Which is then goes all the way back to having a large sight word vocabulary. That goes back to one of the main issues when it comes to reading and even reading comprehension.
All right. So,
I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with Heidi on the whole thing about going back to sight words and making sure that you have an understanding of the sight words. Because if students don't, then you're just going to waste time on how do I sound out the. And we've all seen that probably in our own classrooms where you see kids struggle so much with just the, that there has to be an easier situation for students to be able to understand and to move on. So they just be like, that's the, I know it's the, don't need to have that kind of issue and struggle. And trying to get that all put together. It slows down fluency.
excellent. So the last section that we had to talk about was comprehension. And I think that, we've probably talked about comprehension throughout each one of these different sections to some extent. But, what comprehension is that you understand what you read, that you can recall details, you can tell somebody about it, you get information out of your reading, which of course is the goal of reading and of language. So you can kind of see from our conversation how it's necessary to understand that words are made up of sounds if you're going to read, and that you need to be reasonably fluent if you're going to understand what you read, because if you're using all your mental energy, like Stephen was saying, decoding the word the, it's going to be really hard to get the message from a passage, much less the sentence that you're tripping over some of the simpler words. Did anybody's books have information about how to work specifically on comprehension, or were they more about these kind of building blocks?
Yeah, mine was definitely more about the building blocks and working on the vocabulary in order to understand. So it didn't really touch much on comprehension.
My book just sat there. Go ahead, Heidi.
Steve.
Ladies first. Go ahead.
Okay. Mine was really basic when it comes to comprehension. And basically, if you lack any of the skills required for comprehension, it'll hinder all your reading abilities. So it has to do with building the skills that are required in order to have good comprehension.
And also to agree with Heidi on that is that when kids know how words are put together from the basic principle and they're taught the skills in order to decode, but not just to decode the word in a way, but also understanding that words are going to have different rule sets, and understanding how those apply are going to help them be beneficial in navigating whatever you want them to do with written language, reading, and sleep. So I'm sorry about the last part.
One of the things that my book talked about, and it was like in one chapter at the end, was just kind of the importance of explicitly instructing students about reading strategies and things like that in all of their different classes. Not just saying, okay, in your reading class, we're going to work on these things, and then hopefully you remember that when you get to science class or math class. but they really recommended that, general education teachers or whoever's working with the student in the general education environment is helping students recall these strategies that they've been working on in different contexts. But it didn't talk a whole lot about strategies for comprehension, just that we should kind of push out and make sure that we're reviewing these strategies in different contexts. So we only got a few minutes left here. We got a couple more things that we are trying to get fit into our 45 minutes. One of those things was any gaps in research that we saw in our reading.
I only thing I have something real brief, but there's been hundreds of studies done on reading and the research, but they have not come across that there's any recommendation for how to apply the findings. So they've done lots of research, but they haven't figured out a way to be able to apply what they have found.
That's the joy of educational research, huh? It's a little easier to talk about what you do when you work one-on-one with students than what you're going to do when you have a school system with limited funds, right? The other thing I saw was just kind of like, they're like, oh, we've looked at brain research, imagery, we've seen this, there's definitely something going on here, but it didn't seem like there was a very clear way of saying, oh, this is exactly what's going on with this particular individual. And I think that's why all the recommendations were like, just hit it from every angle, and hopefully you'll kind of find a way around that roadblock.
Yeah, that's how it said in my book was the same way, like mainly just the steps on how you should have students understand language and then build up accordingly. But as you build up accordingly, they should also have understanding or comprehension of why they're learning linguistic layers, those rules that go along with each one. And then as they progress through it, it's supposed to hopefully provide that knowledge base. So if they do have dyslexia, because my book didn't really talk about dyslexia, it was mainly, I kind of felt like it was a manual for teachers to start. This is your initial assessment. This is how you go about teaching these types of concepts to your students, and this is why it's beneficial, and try these strategies in your classroom. But all of these things, if done correctly, from the basics to the more advanced parts of speech, students should be able to navigate print and reading effectively, regardless of dyslexia. At least that's what I got after reading this book.
Excellent. That's kind of how I felt like mine was a good starting point. It had lots of information about why you might want to assess different things and what you might do if you find certain deficits, but it didn't really spell it out for you. So it seemed like a very good resource to have on the shelf when you're like, oh, there's definitely something going on here. What do I need to do to kind of get to the bottom of this? And then presumably I will buy more books. The last thing that we wanted to touch on was just any things that went into prevention. I know somebody talked about how parents speak with their children was important. Was there anything else people ran across that really stuck out to you?
They mentioned for preventing, say, a backslide, sometimes students will kind of catch up. So say if they struggled a little in first grade and they caught up, but now in sixth grade, they're struggling again. It's not that the child has peaked or that they can't do it. It's that the curriculum has changed. And like you guys mentioned with the pyramids, say going from the simpler Anglo-Saxon words of ands and ors and thes to, the scientific definitions and the labels, it's really hard to catch back up. And so they mentioned that you really want to keep track and not just exit the kids out too quickly, but instead kind of keep scaffolding in supports, so that way the student doesn't just crash and burn.
Excellent. Any other last words?
Yeah, I have a little bit to say about that. Mine focuses on with direct instruction about the phonological awareness. In order to prevent it, it says to really have direct instruction and focus on the phonological awareness. This could help in the preventing of some of the reading difficulties.
So just kind of getting an early start on that stuff and making sure that it's an explicit part of our curriculum in the early years.
Yes, and kind of like how Avery said a while back, it has to do with that round table and group discussion, and so the students get more individualized one-on-one.
Excellent. Well, anything else? All right. Well, thank you all for being here. I appreciate the conversation, And let's go ahead and stop the recording.